The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as David stood at the edge, watching his former crew prepare for another day of work. His hands gripped the yellow hard hat so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Months had passed since the accident that changed everything. But some mornings it felt like yesterday. The crane had been lifting steel beams to the 10th floor when something went wrong. One moment David was directing traffic below, the next he was waking up in a hospital bed with doctors explaining how lucky he was to be alive. Lucky. That word had followed him everywhere since then. Lucky to survive. Lucky to walk again. Lucky to still have his job. But David didn't feel lucky. Not when he looked in the mirror each morning and saw the thick pink lines running down the left side of his face, from his temple to his jaw. Not when his left leg refused to bend properly, forcing him to walk with a slight limp that everyone pretended not to notice. And definitely not when he caught his coworkers looking at him with those careful, sympathetic expressions. "Morning, David," called out Tommy, one of the younger guys on the crew. His voice carried that overly cheerful tone people used around him now, like they were talking to someone who might break if they spoke too loudly. David nodded back, forcing a smile that felt unnatural on his scarred face. He'd been a Marine. Before this job, served his country overseas, built a reputation as someone who could handle anything. On construction sites, he'd been the guy everyone looked to when things got tough. Strong, dependable, unshakable. Now he felt like a ghost of that person. "You're on light duty again today," said his supervisor, walking over with a clipboard. Her voice was kind but firm. "It's just quality checks on the lower floors. Take your time. Light duty." The words stung every time he heard them. Crew worked on the dangerous, important stuff high above. David was stuck checking measurements and making sure paint was dry. Work that any rookie could do. Work that didn't require the 20 years of experience he'd built up. He made his way to the elevator. Each step a reminder of what he'd lost. Other workers stepped aside to let him pass, their eyes quickly looking away when he caught them staring. Some smiled and nodded, trying to be friendly. Others whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. "Poor guy," he caught someone saying behind him. "He'll never be the same." The elevator doors closed with a soft ding, and David found himself alone with his reflection in the polished steel. The scars were healing, the doctors said. They'd fade some with time, but they'd never disappear completely. His left eye drooped slightly now, and when he smiled, the right side of his mouth moved properly. For months after leaving the hospital, he'd avoided mirrors altogether. Covered the one in his bathroom, looked away when passing store windows. Anything to avoid seeing what he'd become. But standing here now, trapped with his own image, something felt different. The 4th floor was quiet, except for the distant sounds of construction above. David pulled out his measuring tape and clipboard, going through the motions of his assigned tasks, check the wall spacing, mark any defects, sign off on completed sections. Simple, mindless work that left too much room for thinking. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "How was therapy yesterday? Did you talk to Dr. Peterson about going back to regular duties?" He'd stopped going to therapy 3 weeks ago. What was the point? The counselor kept asking how he felt about his new normal and whether he'd accepted his limitations. David wasn't ready to accept anything. He wasn't ready to be grateful for surviving when surviving felt like losing everything that mattered. Lunchtime came and went. David ate alone at a small table in the break room while the real crews gathered around the bigger tables, talking about their morning's work, planning the afternoon, discussing weekend plans, asking polite questions about how he was feeling, but the conversations always felt forced. Jake, one of his old crew members, sat down across from him. "Hey man, how you holding up?" "Fine," David replied automatically. It was his standard answer to that question now. "Listen, we're all going to Murphy's after work Friday. You should come." David had heard this invitation before. He'd show up. Everyone would be extra nice to him, and he'd spend the evening feeling like a charity case. "Thanks, but I've got plans." Jake nodded, understanding the real meaning behind the polite decline. "Well, offer stands if you change your mind." After lunch, David found himself in the safety equipment room, supposedly checking inventory, but really just hiding from the pity and awkward conversations. This used to be his domain back when he led safety briefings for new workers. He'd stand in front of groups, sharing war stories and construction wisdom, making sure everyone went home in one piece. Now someone else did those briefings. Someone whose face didn't make new hires uncomfortable. Someone who looked like what a construction leader was supposed to look like. The afternoon dragged on. More measurements, more check marks on forms, more careful conversations with people who treated him like he was made of glass. When 5 o'clock finally came, David was ready to escape. He gathered his things slowly, letting most of the crew leave first. The parking lot was nearly empty by the time he made it to his truck. As he drove home through familiar streets, he passed other construction sites, other crews heading home after real days of real work. His apartment was small and quiet, too quiet. He'd moved here after the accident when climbing stairs to his old second-floor place became too difficult. Everything was on one level now. Everything designed for his new limitations. David microwaved a frozen dinner and ate it standing at his kitchen counter, looking out the window at the neighbor's yard, where kids were playing soccer. Their laughter drifted through the glass, a sound from a world that felt increasingly distant. After dinner, he sat in his living room with the TV on, but not really watching. His laptop was open on the coffee table, showing job listings he'd been browsing. Office work mostly. Computer jobs. Safe indoor positions where his scars wouldn't matter and his limp wouldn't slow anyone down. But every time he started to fill out an application, something stopped him. This wasn't who he was. He was a builder, a creator, someone who worked with his hands and solved real problems. The idea of spending his days in a cubicle felt like another kind of death. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his mother's number, but he let it go to voicemail. He knew what she'd say, that he should be grateful, that things could have been worse, that maybe this was a sign to try something new, something safer. Everyone wanted him to move on, to accept this new version of himself. But sitting there in the growing darkness of his apartment, David realized he wasn't ready to give up on the person he used to be. Not yet. He walked to his bathroom and flipped on the light, forcing himself to look in the mirror he'd been avoiding for so long. The scars were still there, still angry and obvious. His face was still crooked, still a reminder of the worst day of his life, but looking closer, past the damage, he could still see traces of the man he'd been. The same brown eyes that had seen combat overseas and dangerous construction sites at home, the same stubborn jawline that had gotten him through Marine training and 20 years of hard work. Maybe everyone was wrong. Maybe his story wasn't over. Maybe these scars weren't the end of something, the beginning of something else entirely. For the first time in 18 months, David smiled at his reflection. It was crooked and imperfect, but it was real. And somewhere deep inside he felt a familiar stirring. The same feeling that had made him volunteer for difficult missions in the Marines. The same instinct that had pushed him to take on leadership, roles at work. He wasn't ready to accept defeat, not yet. 3 weeks after David's moment of truth in the mirror, the company called an all-hands safety meeting. These meetings happened every quarter, usually in the main conference room with folding chairs arranged in neat rows. David always sat in the back now, partly because of his limp and partly because he preferred to stay invisible. The room buzzed with the usual pre-meeting chatter. Guys comparing weekend plans, complaining about new regulations, joking about which supervisor would fall asleep during the presentation. David pulled out his phone and pretended to check messages. Anything to avoid the awkward small talk. Linda, the safety coordinator, walked to the front with her usual stack of papers and tired expression. She'd been doing these meetings for 5 years, and it showed. The same recycled PowerPoint slides, same warnings about hard hats and safety harnesses that everyone had heard 100 times before. "All right, everyone, let's get started," she announced, waiting for the room to quiet down. "I know you all want to get back to work, so I'll keep this brief." David half listened as she went through the standard routine. Monthly accident statistics, reminders about reporting procedures, updates on new safety equipment. The guys around him checked their phones or stared out the window, going through the motions of paying attention. Then Linda said something that made David's head snap up. We need someone to take over the new worker orientation program. Corporate wants us to expand our safety training, especially for the younger guys coming in. It's additional responsibility, but it comes with a small bump in pay." The room went silent. David looked around and saw the same expression on every face. Interest mixed with reluctance. Everyone could use extra money, but nobody wanted to deal with training rookies on top of their regular workload. Linda waited, scanning the room hopefully. Any volunteers? More silence. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. David felt that familiar, stirring in his chest, the same feeling he'd had in the mirror 3 weeks ago. Before he could talk himself out of it, his hand was in the air. The entire room turned to stare at him. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even Linda looked surprised, her eyebrows raised as she processed what she was seeing. "David," she said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "You want to volunteer for this?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his military training kicking in automatically. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Linda glanced around the room, maybe hoping someone else would raise their hand too. When nobody did, she nodded slowly. "Okay then, see me after the meeting and we'll discuss details." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. David could feel eyes on him, could almost hear the whispered conversations that would start the moment. Everyone left the room. What was he thinking? Could he handle it? Was this just pity from management? When the meeting ended, most guys filed out quickly, eager to get back to work. A few lingered, shooting curious glances in David's direction. His old crew member Jake walked past and clapped him on the shoulder. "Good for you, man," Jake said quietly. "About time you got back in the game." After everyone left, David approached Linda's desk. She was gathering her papers, still looking somewhat puzzled by the turn of events. "So," she began, "tell me why you want this job." David had been asking himself the same question for the past 10 minutes. "I've got experience training people. Did it in the Marines, did it here before. ... He gestured vaguely at his face. "For the accident. I know safety matters. I know what happens when it doesn't." Linda studied him for a long moment. "Isn't easy work, David? These new guys, some of them think they know everything. Some of them are scared of their own shadows. You'll need to command respect while keeping them engaged. Think you can handle that?" "Yes, ma'am, I do." She pulled out a thick binder and set it on the desk between them. "Company manual, safety protocols, training schedules. Next group starts Monday. That gives you 4 days to prepare." She paused. "David, I'm glad you volunteered. I need someone who actually cares about this stuff." That evening, David spread the training materials across his kitchen table. The binder was thick with regulations, procedures, and corporate boilerplate that would put anyone to sleep. But buried in there were real lessons. Life-saving information that could prevent other people from ending up like him. He started making notes, drawing from his military experience and 20 years of construction work, how to spot dangerous situations before they became disasters, how to speak up when something felt wrong, how to look out for your crewmates. Real practical knowledge that went beyond the official handbook. By midnight, he had filled a legal pad with ideas. Training scenarios, discussion points, ways to make safety training actually matter instead of just being another box to check. For the first time since his accident, David felt energized about work. Monday morning arrived with a group of 8 new hires gathered in the training room. They were young, mostly in their early 20s, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously hurt. David recognized the type immediately. He'd been one of them once. When he walked into the room, their conversations stopped. He could see them taking in his scars, his slight limp, the way his smile only worked on one side. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable. One kid in the back actually whispered something to his neighbor. David had prepared for this moment. Instead of pretending his appearance didn't matter, he decided to address it head-on. "Morning, everyone. I'm David, and I'll be handling your safety orientation this week." He gestured to his face with no self-consciousness. "You're looking at my scars. That's normal. These came from a crane accident 18 months ago. One moment of carelessness, one mechanical failure, and everything changed. The room was completely silent now. No whispers, no fidgeting, just 8 pairs of eyes focused entirely on him. "These scars remind me every day why we're here," David continued. "Why safety isn't just rules and regulations, but the difference between going home to your families and ending up in a hospital bed, or worse." He opened his training folder and looked around the room. "Over the next week, I'm going to teach you how to spot dangers before they spot you, how to trust your instincts when something feels wrong, how to speak up even when more experienced guys tell you to keep quiet. But most importantly, I'm going to teach you how to look out for each other." A hand went up in the middle of the group. "What happened exactly? With the crane, I mean?" David had been dreading this question, but now that it came, he found it easier to answer than expected. "Equipment failure during a routine lift. I was in the wrong place when things went bad. The safety protocols we had weren't enough because nobody had planned for that specific scenario." "Could it have been prevented?" asked another trainee. "Maybe. Probably. That's what we're here to figure out." David pulled up his first training slide. "Let's start with hazard recognition." The rest of the morning flew by. David found himself drawing on stories from his military service, examples from construction sites, real situations where quick thinking and proper procedures had saved lives. The trainees asked questions, shared their own concerns, engaged with the material in ways he hadn't expected. During lunch break, one of the younger guys approached him. "This is different from safety training at my last job. That was just watching videos and signing papers." "Videos don't keep you alive," David replied. "Understanding does. Caring does. Looking out for each other does." By the end of the first day, David felt something he hadn't experienced in over a year. Purpose. These weren't just random safety statistics or corporate requirements. These were real people who would go on to work dangerous jobs, start families, build lives. What he taught them in this room could make the difference between tragedy and triumph. Walking to his truck that evening, David caught his reflection in the building's glass doors. The scars were still there, still obvious. But for the first time, they didn't make him want to look away. They were part of his story now, part of what made him qualified to do this job. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "How was your first day?" David thought for a moment before typing back. "Good, really good. I think I found something that matters." And for the first time since his accident, he meant it completely. Word traveled fast on construction sites. By the end of David's first week training new workers, stories were already spreading through the company. Stories about the guy with the scars who made safety training actually interesting. Stories about how he'd stopped a trainee from making a dangerous mistake on day 3, preventing what could have been a serious accident. David didn't realize how much attention he was getting until his supervisor called him into her office on Friday afternoon. Linda sat behind her desk with a stack of evaluation forms and something that looked almost like a smile. "Sit down, David," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "We need to talk." His heart sank. Had he overstepped somehow? Were the trainees complaining? Maybe taking on this responsibility had been a mistake after all? "Relax," Linda said, noticing his expression. "This is good news. I've got feedback forms here from your first group of trainees. Want to know what they said?" David nodded, not trusting his voice. "Best safety training I've ever had," she read from the first form. "Actually learned things that will keep me alive." She picked up another. "Instructor knows his stuff and cares about our safety, not just checking boxes." And another. "Finally, someone who treats us like adults and explains why rules matter." Linda set down the papers and looked at him directly. "David, in 5 years of running these programs, I've never seen feedback like this. Usually we get complaints about boring presentations and waste of time. These kids are actually excited. About safety protocols, they're good kids," David replied. "They just needed someone to show them why it matters. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Corporate wants you to expand the program. Instead of 1 group per month, they want 2. And they want you to develop advanced training for workers who've been here a while." David felt a surge of something he'd almost forgotten. Pride in work well done. Recognition for abilities he'd thought were lost forever. I'd like that. I've got ideas for scenarios based on real situations, ways to practice emergency responses. Save it for the proposal, Linda interrupted, but she was smiling now. Write up what you want to do, and I'll pass it upstairs. But David, she paused. Don't let this go to your head. There are people here who aren't happy about your success. Over the following weeks, David threw himself into developing new training modules. He arrived at work an hour early each day, staying late to research accident reports and safety innovations. His small apartment became a makeshift office, with training materials covering every surface. He created scenarios based on real emergencies he'd witnessed or heard about. How to respond when a coworker gets injured. What to do if equipment fails in dangerous ways. How to recognize when someone is working unsafely and needs help. Each lesson was built around actual situations, not theoretical problems from a textbook. The response was immediate and obvious. Workers who completed his advanced training started catching safety violations that had been overlooked for years. They spoke up more often when something seemed wrong. They looked out for each other in ways that went beyond basic job requirements. Accident rate for workers who'd been through David's programs dropped to almost zero over 3 months. Other departments started requesting his training sessions. Project managers began specifically asking for crew members who'd completed his courses. But success brought unexpected challenges. Who does he think he is? David overheard one of the older workers saying in the break room, acting like he's some kind of hero because of what happened to his face. The speaker was Mike, a 20-year veteran who'd been with the company since before David arrived. Mike had always been dismissive of safety training, calling it a waste of time that kept real workers from doing real work. Companies just giving him special treatment, Mike continued, not noticing that David had entered the room. It's a feel-good story for the corporate newsletter. Wait until the novelty wears off. David grabbed his coffee and left without saying anything, but the words stung. Was he getting special treatment? Were his successes real? Or just people being nice to the guy with the messed-up face? The doubt followed him through the rest of the day and into the evening. Sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by training materials he'd been working on, David wondered if Mike was right. Maybe he was just a charity case, a feel-good project that made management look compassionate. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Hello? Is this David? The safety instructor? Yes. Who's this? My name's Ryan. I went through your training program last month. I'm calling because something happened today, and I wanted to thank you. David sat up straighter. What happened? I was working with a crew on the Morrison project, and I noticed the guy operating the crane seemed off. Not focused, you know? Maybe tired or distracted. Your voice was in my head saying to trust my instincts, so I spoke up. Good for you. What did you find? Turns out the operator was on medication that made him drowsy. He didn't realize it was affecting his judgment, if we hadn't caught it. ... Ryan's voice trailed off.
Oh.
Well, let's just say your training probably prevented a serious accident today. After Ryan hung up, David sat in his quiet apartment thinking about the call. This wasn't about special treatment or feel-good stories. This was about real people staying safe because of knowledge he'd shared with them. The training was working exactly as intended. The next morning, David arrived at work to find a small crowd gathered around the safety bulletin board. Someone had posted an article from the industry newsletter about companies with outstanding safety records. Their company was featured prominently, with specific mention of their innovative training programs. Congratulations, said Carol from the front office, walking past with a genuine smile. This is really something to be proud of. More people stopped by to offer congratulations. Some were coworkers who'd supported him from the beginning. Others were supervisors who'd seen the results firsthand. Even a few of the skeptics acknowledged that whatever he was doing seemed to be working. But the moment that mattered most came during lunch break. David was eating alone at his usual table when Jake approached with his whole crew following behind. If we sit, Jake asked. David gestured to the empty chairs, curious about what was happening. We've been talking, Jake began, and we want to go through your advanced training program. All of us. Why? David asked, genuinely surprised. Because we've seen the difference it makes, replied one of the other crew members. It's the guys who've been through your training. They spot things we miss. They ask questions we don't think to ask. We want to be better at keeping each other safe. That afternoon, David found himself designing yet another training module. This one specifically for experienced workers who thought they'd seen everything. As he worked, he realized something important had shifted. It wasn't just surviving his new reality anymore. He was building something meaningful from it. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. Saw the article online. Mom and Dad are so proud. We all are. David looked around his small apartment, taking in the training materials, safety manuals, and lesson plans that had taken over his living space. 6 months ago, this place had felt like a prison, a retreat from a world that no longer had a place. For him now, it felt like mission control. The scars on his face were still there, still noticeable to anyone who looked. His limp hadn't improved and probably never would. But sitting there surrounded by evidence of work that mattered, David realized something profound. He wasn't the same person he'd been before the accident. He was better. The old David had been good at his job, reliable and skilled. But this David was building something that would outlast any single project or construction site. He was creating a culture where people looked out for each other, where safety wasn't just a rule, but a way of thinking. And that legacy, he knew, was worth more than any building he'd ever helped construct. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March. David was reviewing training schedules when Linda walked into his small office with an expression he'd never seen before. Part excitement, part terror. "David, we just got the biggest contract in company history," she announced, setting a thick folder on his desk. "The Riverside Bridge Project. State Highway Department. 18 months, $40 million. David whistled low. "Huge. Congratulations. Here's the thing," Linda continued, pulling up a chair. "They awarded us this contract partly because of our safety record. The improvements you've made, the training programs, the accident reduction, it all went into our bid package." Felt a mix of pride and pressure. That's great news. It gets better and scarier. Linda opened the folder, revealing architectural drawings and specifications. "They want you as the lead safety coordinator for the entire project. Not just training, but hands-on safety management for the biggest job we've ever taken on." David stared at the blueprint spread before him. A cable-stayed bridge spanning the Riverside Canyon, with towers reaching 250 feet into the sky. Multiple construction phases, specialized equipment, dozens of subcontractors. The complexity was staggering. "Linda, I appreciate the confidence, but I've never managed something this big. The responsibility, the liability, ... "David," she interrupted, "6 months ago nobody would have given you this opportunity, including me. But you've proven yourself. The company trusts you. More importantly, the workers trust you. That's what we need on a project like this." That evening, David spread the project plans across his kitchen table. The bridge was beautiful in the drawings, elegant and strong, but all he could see were the dangers. Workers operating at extreme heights, heavy machinery moving massive steel, cables, weather delays that could force crews to work in dangerous conditions. Every scenario he'd trained workers for could happen on this project, often simultaneously. If something went wrong, it wouldn't just be one person getting hurt. It could be catastrophic. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his old crew chief from his Marine days. "David, heard through the grapevine, you've got a big promotion. Bridge project?" "Word travels fast," David replied. "How'd you hear about it?" "My nephew works for one of the subcontractors. Says everyone's talking about the guy with the scars who's running safety." "Proud of you, man." David realized something important. This project wasn't just about him anymore. His reputation was preceding him. Workers he'd never met were expecting him to keep them safe based on stories. They'd heard about his training programs. The pressure was enormous, but so was the opportunity. If he could manage safety successfully on a project this size, it would prove that his transformation was complete. That the accident hadn't ended his career, but started a new and better one. Construction began in April with a crew of over 100 workers from 6 different companies. David arrived on site before dawn each day, walking the perimeter, checking equipment, reviewing safety protocols with crew chiefs. The first month went smoothly. Foundation work, access road construction, basic setup activities. David's training programs were working exactly as designed. Workers spotted potential hazards before they became problems. Communication between crews was clear and immediate. But bridges aren't built on the ground. In May, work began on the tower foundations in the river. Crews working from barges, dealing with water hazards, weather delays, and equipment that had to be transported by boat. David found himself learning new safety challenges every day. "You doing okay?" asked Tom, one of the veteran crane operators. During a morning briefing, "You look like you haven't slept in a week." David rubbed his eyes. "Just want to make sure we're covering everything. This is a lot more complex than I expected." "Hey," Tom said quietly. "I've worked with a lot of safety coordinators over the years. Most of them are just checking boxes, covering their backs. You actually care about keeping us alive. We notice that. We appreciate it." By June, the bridge towers were rising above the canyon. David spent his days climbing scaffolding, inspecting harness systems, reviewing lift plans for massive steel sections. His limp made the climbing harder, but he refused to manage safety from the ground. If he was asking workers to take risks, he needed to understand those risks personally. Then came the morning that tested everything he'd built. It was a Wednesday in July, hot and humid, with scattered thunderstorms forecast for the afternoon. The crew was racing to complete a critical cable installation before the weather moved in. David was on the bridge deck, 180 feet above the river. When he heard the sound that still haunted his nightmares, metal stress, groaning under load. Same sound he'd heard just before his accident 18 months earlier. One of the main lifting cables was showing signs of fatigue, developing small wire breaks that could lead to catastrophic failure. The cable was supporting a 15-ton steel section directly over a crew of 8 workers. "Stop everything," David called out, his voice carrying across the construction site. "Emergency shutdown now." The work site erupted in coordinated chaos. But it was controlled chaos. Every worker knew the emergency procedures. Every crew chief understood the signals. Every operator knew exactly what to do when the safety coordinator called for an immediate stop. Within 90 seconds, all workers were clear of the danger zone. The damaged cable was isolated and secured. What could have been a disaster became a textbook example of emergency response. Later, as investigators examined the failed cable, David stood on the bridge deck, thinking about how different this could have been. Without proper training, without clear communication, without workers who trusted the safety protocols enough to stop everything immediately, people would have died. "Hell of a save," said the project manager, walking up beside him. "How'd you spot it so fast?" David gestured to his scarred face. "Experience, and the worst kind of motivation to prevent it from happening to anyone else." That evening, David sat in his truck in the project parking lot, too emotionally drained to drive home yet. His phone buzzed with text messages from crew members who'd heard about the incident. "Thanks for keeping us safe. Great catch today. We trust you completely." The last message was from Ryan, the young worker who'd called months earlier about preventing an accident on another job. "Heard what happened today? You saved lives. It's what heroes do." David stared at that message for a long time. Hero, it wasn't a word he'd ever applied to himself. He'd just been doing his job, using knowledge earned through pain and failure to protect other people. But sitting there in the growing darkness, looking up at the bridge tower silhouetted against the stars, David realized something profound had happened. The scared, broken man who'd avoided mirrors and hidden from his colleagues was gone. In his place was someone who could spot danger before it struck, someone who could command respect and trust from workers who put their lives in his hands every day, someone who had turned the worst experience of his life into the foundation for saving others. The bridge project would continue for another year. There would be other challenges, other close calls, other opportunities to prove himself. But tonight, David knew with absolute certainty that he'd found his calling. The accident had taken away the person he used to be, but it had given him someone better to become. Starting his truck and heading home, David caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The scars were still there, still obvious, but they no longer looked like marks of defeat. They looked like badges of honor. 2 years after the cable incident at Riverside Bridge, David was reviewing training schedules in his new office when his assistant knocked on the door. The office was bigger now, with windows overlooking the construction yard and walls covered with safety awards and project photos. "David, there's a call for you. Someone from the National Safety Council in Chicago." David picked up the phone, expecting another routine consultation request. Instead, he heard something that made him sit up straight. "Mr. David, this is Robert Chen from the National Safety Council. We'd like you to be our keynote speaker at this year's annual conference. Your safety innovations and the Riverside Bridge incident have become case studies in our industry training programs." David was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd just heard. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" "We want you to speak to 3,000 safety professionals from across the country. Your methods have reduced workplace accidents at levels we've never seen before. Construction companies are implementing your training programs nationwide." After hanging up, David sat back in his chair, still stunned. 3 years ago, he'd been hiding from mirrors and avoiding conversations. Professional organizations wanted him to share his expertise with the entire industry. The conference in Chicago was unlike anything David had ever experienced. Walking through the convention center, he saw his name on banners and programs. Attendees stopped him in hallways, recognizing his face from industry publications. His scars, once a source of shame, had become his trademark. "You're the bridge guy," said a young safety coordinator from Texas. "I use your emergency response protocols on every job site. They work." During his presentation, David looked out at an audience of thousands: safety managers, construction executives, government officials, all listening intently as he shared lessons learned from his darkest moment. 3 years ago, I thought my career was over," he told them. "I thought my scars meant I was broken, useless, done. I was wrong. Sometimes what breaks us actually prepares us for what we're meant to do." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. After the conference, the opportunities came flooding in. Consulting contracts with major construction firms, a book deal for building safety from the ground up, which would become required reading in engineering schools, speaking engagements across the country where companies paid premium fees for his expertise. But David never forgot where he came from. He still insisted on working directly with construction crews, still wore a hard hat and climbed scaffolding despite his limp. Success hadn't changed his core mission of keeping workers safe. 6 months later, he was consulting on a high-rise project in Denver when a young woman approached him during a break. She had burned scars covering the left side of her face and neck, obviously from a serious fire. "Excuse me, are you David?" she asked nervously. "The safety expert?" "That's me. What can I do for you?" "My name's Ashley. I'm a structural engineer, or trying to be. I graduated top of my class, but nobody wants to hire me. They say clients won't feel comfortable working with someone who looks like this." She gestured to her scars. David studied her for a moment, seeing in her eyes the same doubt and determination he'd wrestled with years before. Same pain of being judged by appearance rather than ability. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure. Do you know your job better than most people with?" "Twice my experience." "Then let me tell you something important. Those scars aren't a liability. They're proof you've already survived the worst thing that's likely to happen in this industry. Everything else is just engineering problems to solve." Ashley's eyes brightened. "Slightly? You really think so?" "I know so. Here's what we're going to do." David pulled out his business card and wrote something on the back. "This is the contact for a firm I consult with. You're looking for a structural engineer for a bridge project in California. Tell them I recommended you specifically because of your qualifications and your experience overcoming challenges." 3 months later, David received a photo in the mail. Ashley standing on a construction site, wearing a hard hat and safety vest, pointing at structural drawings with a team of workers gathered around her. The accompanying note was simple: "Starting my own consulting firm next month. Thank you for showing me that scars can be credentials." David kept that photo on his desk next to his original hard hat from the crane accident. Both reminded him daily that his journey from victim to leader had been worth every difficult step. The construction industry publication that featured him on their cover called him the man who changed safety forever. Universities invited him to speak at graduation ceremonies. Young engineers and safety professionals sought him out for his mentorship and advice. But the moment that meant the most came during a routine visit to one of his old job sites. He was walking through the break room when he overheard a conversation between two workers he'd trained years earlier. Remember when David first came back after his accident? One was saying, all felt sorry for him, thought his career was over. Best thing that ever happened to this company, replied the other. Guy's a legend now. Saved more lives than we'll ever know. David smiled and kept walking, not wanting to interrupt their conversation. Legend? It wasn't a word he'd ever expected to have associated with his name. That evening, he called his sister from his hotel room. You know what's funny? He said. For years after the accident, I thought those scars defined me as damaged, broken, less than I used to be. And now? Now I realize they define me as someone who survived something terrible and used that experience to protect other people. They're not marks of failure. They're marks of purpose. The next morning, David stood in front of another group of trainees, sharing safety protocols that had prevented countless accidents across the industry. As he spoke, he noticed something that always made him smile. These workers weren't staring at his scars with pity or discomfort. They were looking at them with respect, recognition, even admiration. They saw what he had become rather than what he had lost. After the session, David walked through the construction site, checking safety procedures, talking with crews, making sure everyone had what they needed to go home safely that day. His limp was still noticeable, his scars still obvious, his smile still crooked, but he carried himself differently now, with confidence earned through trial by fire, with authority built on expertise and compassion, with the quiet dignity of someone who had transformed personal tragedy to public service. The broken man who had once avoided mirrors and hidden from colleagues was gone completely. In his place stood someone who commanded respect, not despite his scars, but because of them. Someone who had proven that true strength isn't about avoiding damage, but about deciding what to build from the pieces. David had walked into legend not by forgetting his worst day, but by making sure it became the foundation for his best work. And every worker who went home safe because of his training was proof that sometimes our greatest victories rise from our deepest defeats. The warrior's scars had become his credentials, and his pain had become his purpose. In an industry where legends are usually built on what people create, David had built his on what he had overcome and what he had taught others to overcome as well. He was no longer the man who had been broken by an accident. He was the man who had refused to stay broken, and in refusing had shown countless others that they didn't have to stay broken either.